If Microsoft adopted Linux as the kernel for Windows, what would be the impact on the software industry? This question comes from @methylpulv over on Twitter, and it's a great question. I've talked about this a bit in the past. I am of the opinion that we can't be far out from Microsoft making such a decision. Whether it's Linux or one of the various BSDs or heck, Haiku, there's a lot of great open source or free software kernels out there. And it just makes good business sense for Microsoft to not be reinventing the wheel all the time when what makes Windows really isn't the Windows kernel. It's really not. To give you a good example of that, you can run Win32 software built for, say, Windows 98 or a Millennium Edition under Windows 10. At least for the most part, you can. Those two operating systems, 98 versus Windows 10, have not the same kernel. Not at all. It's not even remotely the same kernel. They are fundamentally very, very different systems. And yet they are both Windows. Yet they both run Windows software. And there is no reason Microsoft can't have a, let's say, Windows X. Because that's a ridiculous thing to call any operating system. Is just add an X on the end. But they call it Windows X, right? And that'll be the next version after 10 or something like that. And it'll use, let's say, for kicks and giggles, let's say it uses whatever the modern Linux kernel is. Now, from Microsoft's point of view, they really are just providing the user level stuff that sits on top of that. They're making sure that their file system drivers are what they expect it to be, that Win32 applications run, that .NET applications run, and all that sort of thing. And that's all pretty easy to do nowadays using software that already exists, whether it's Wine, which honestly, Wine in many cases provides better Win32 compatibility than Windows 10 does itself. That's just straight up true, and it's ridiculous, but it's true. And if Microsoft got into that, I mean, considering Microsoft already kind of bought the company that was pushing Mono, the open source implementation of .NET, they've got it all in house. They're ready to rock and roll and put all of their resources into building a system like that. There's no reason to not to make that work, and it's good financial sense for them. Building and testing and maintaining a complete kernel as large as the Windows NT kernel that they're currently using for Windows 10 or Linux is huge. It's a monstrous investment. If they could take that money and put it elsewhere, even if they just cut it in half, and they said half the people that are working on the Windows kernel right now move over and work on device drivers for Linux and all these other things, and then we'll reallocate all that development and manpower resources to all the user land stuff, the things that make Windows Windows. Well, that just makes sense. I would do that. If I was a manager at Microsoft, I would absolutely do that. And the industry as a whole, should that happen, and I really do think it will. I don't know if it'll be Linux, but it'll be an open kernel. The industry as a whole really won't see any impact from that, because it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see a Windows being a Linux system in any way that we would recognize it. Much the same as we don't really recognize, let's say, Android as a Linux system. Not for the most part. It's basically using Linux as the kernel and then provides a Java-based runtime environment on top of that where the applications actually live. So it's really its own thing. I mean, if Google decided to swap out Linux for Fuchsia or one other kernel, or heck, the Windows kernel in Android, right? Let's say they use the Windows kernel in Android. It's theoretically possible. Most applications wouldn't change in any way, shape, or form. Most users would never even necessarily know it. I mean, a few of us that use some of those underlying tools like Termux or those abilities to get at and run a true environment on an Android device, we would be impacted. But we're very, very small minority of the people out there, right? So what would the industry do? It would go on making Windows applications. It would go on making DirectX applications. And it would go on making OpenGL applications. It would just be making them on Windows that now has a Linux kernel. There would be no other real net change. I foresee Microsoft doing this. I don't think it's going to be in the next couple of months. I think it's a long-term thing. But I would be really surprised if there's not an initiative inside Microsoft to rebase, let's say, a new future prototype Microsoft Windows on some sort of completely open kernel, because it just makes sense. And it won't necessarily make the lives of people porting Linux software, traditional Linux software like GTK, Qt, and everything else, any easier or harder, because Windows is still going to be Windows. People are still going to be coding against, .NET and MFC and Win32 APIs and all that stuff, right? So there's really not going to be a net change. It would be interesting in that it would be like some sort of vindication. I mean, Linus would just be flipping out. He'd be like, yeah, not only did Microsoft make some Windows software, they made Windows based on my kernel. I mean, that's a victory for Linux if there ever was one. But it doesn't necessarily change anything in the actual market. It just would be cool from like a Linux powwow point of view. It'd be like, yeah, cool. Even Microsoft agrees. They really like Linux, right? They base their whole operating system on it. But there really wouldn't be a big change. I think it's a fascinating thing that'll happen. I hope it's Linux, just because I think that'd be the best choice for Microsoft to make. But in theory, they could do NetBSD or something like that too. I mean, those would be totally viable choices for them, and just put all their resources into adding the features that they feel like they need and adding device driver support. In that regard, the additional help of building more device drivers for Linux would, I guess, be probably the big impact, is that we would get more device driver support for Linux. But then again, that's really hasn't been a problem over the last few years. We've already got device driver support for the vast majority of hardware components out there. So I don't know that we need to worry about it too much. Anyway, I think it's a fascinating question, one to ponder on. I truly believe Microsoft will do this. I know I'm probably in the minority on that one. But from a managerial perspective, it does make sense. And when it happens, will I use Windows? Probably not. Because again, it doesn't matter necessarily in this case what kernel it's running. It's still going to be a giant, mostly closed source operating system. They're not going to make a Linux-based Windows and suddenly open source Explorer.exe and their entire, MFC libraries and everything else. No, they're just gonna put all their closed source stuff on top of Linux, which most of it will run unmodified right now. Which is kind of an interesting idea. I wonder if anyone's taken like the things like Explorer.exe and all the various other tools and tried to just utilize in place all of the existing Win32 stuff, like let's say from Windows 2000 or something like that, and run it on a Linux desktop running Wine and various other things to just see if it could run, just to have a fully functioning Windows environment. It'd be fun to do. You couldn't do much with it beyond that, but it'd be fun to do. Anyway, it's a really great question, Methylpulv, and I think it'll happen. And of course, this episode of the Lunduke Show is brought to you by Linode, who just opened their 10th data center. 10. They have 10 data centers around the world. How crazy is that? They have 10 data centers. This one's in Toronto, up in Ontario, Canada, but 10 data centers. Anyway, if you go to linode.com, you can set up a server there, a nice little VPS server. You get $20 credit if you go to linode.com/Lunduke. And hey, $20 is $20. You can go, $20 goes a long way in setting up a little lightweight VPS. Highly recommended. Go check them out if you want to set up a Nextcloud server, your own blog, what have you. It's truly fantastic, and thanks to Linode for supporting shows like this and all the various Linux conferences. I just got back from Linux Fest Northwest. They were there supporting Linux Fest. They were there supporting other content creators, and I love it. I love companies who benefit from Linux, benefit from open source and all the good stuff that free software provides, and then they give back. They give back to the conferences and the projects and the spokespeople and everybody. I love that. So linode.com/Lunduke. And you can go to lunduke.com. There's other URLs and thingamadoodads and who's a what's. It's all going on over here. All right. I'll see you guys later.